Khalid bin Farhan al-Saud, whose disagreement with the monarchy's methods forced him to become a dissident himself.
The government is obviously scared of the Arab revolutions, and they've responded as they usually do, by resorting to oppression, violence, arbitrary law, and arrest. The easiest thing they can do is deprive you of your salary or fire you altogether. The ruling regime is not guided by justice, and this is especially true of the Ministry of Interior. There is no independent judiciary, as both police and the prosecutor's office are accountable to the Interior Ministry. The ministry's officials investigate crimes, they call them crimes, related to freedom of speech. So they fabricate evidence, don't allow people to have attorneys. Things like that happen all over the place. They even put people under arrest for an indefinite amount of time. Even if a court rules to release such a criminal, the Ministry of Interior keeps him in prison, even though there is a court order to release him. There have even been killings. And as for the external opposition, Saudi intelligence forces find these people abroad. There is no safety inside or outside the country.
Could you describe these people who oppose the royal family, and what are their goals?
Opposition used to demand wider people's representation in governing bodies, more rights and freedoms. But the authorities reacted with violence and persecution instead of a dialogue. Now the opposition wants this regime gone.
We both know that despite numerous human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, your country seldom faces criticism from the West, and from the United States in particular. When senior U.S. officials meet with their Saudi counterparts, do you think they convey any critical comments from Washington vis-à-vis Riyadh?
The White House certainly does maintain a long-standing alliance with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, cemented by common interests in the Middle East. To that end, there are classified contacts between Riyadh and the U.S. administration. In recent time, they have been employed to step up the government-administered reforms. But those reforms are not driven by the elite's desire to empower the people of the kingdom. Instead, they are merely urged by reforms that the regime might fall unless it reforms itself. Oppression is widespread in Saudi Arabia. There is no free speech, no freedom of expression. Corruption is rampant in all areas. From low-level bureaucrats to high-ranking officials, every civil servant is very skillful in using bribes in their operations.
But while foreign nations turn a blind eye on the Saudi regime's crackdown, the monarchy is still freely dictating to other countries in the region liberal ideas and tolerance. RT's Lindsay France takes a look at Saudi Arabia's own approach to the spread of democratic thoughts in their own nation.
As Saudi Arabia violently squashes the voice of any opposition, we see it sitting front and center in discussions of the democratic transition of power within other countries, such as Syria. On the one hand, it reportedly ships arms to the opposition in Syria. On the other hand, peaceful opposition in Saudi Arabia is answered with prison sentences, torture, even death for people who voiced their own opinion. In fact, in October 2012, Amnesty International called on the Saudi authorities to stop using excessive force against pro-democracy protesters. Here are just a few examples from this year alone. On June 17th, Miklif al-Shamari was convicted of sowing discord and other offenses through writings and exposure of human rights abuses. He got 5 years in prison. June 24th, 7 men were convicted of inciting protests, illegal gatherings, and breaking allegiance with the king, mostly by joining Facebook pages and posting messages. They each got between 5 and 10 years in prison. Then we've got website editor Raif Badawi, convicted of insulting Islam and authorities through his website and during television interviews. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and 600 lashes. In these conditions, anyone with something substantial to say about the government, society, or religion wouldn't be blamed for keeping a low profile. And this is where the man being called the Saudi Assange comes in. No one knows who he is, what he looks like, or where he lives. His prolific tweets denouncing the ruling family as corrupt and enriching themselves from government coffers have earned him over 1 million followers. He is known only as Mujtahid. I spoke with him over Google Chat to find out why he stays in hiding, because it's not for safety. I asked him why he remains anonymous. He said, ironically, anonymity boosts his credibility and encourages people to follow him and talk about his stories without worrying. I asked if this meant that people could pay less attention to his biography and more attention to his message. He pointed out the regime can destroy your credibility easily and deter people from dealing with you if your identity is public. While Mujtahid is forced underground, a new monarchy-backed religious diversity center has launched its own charm offensive in Vienna. According to its mission statement, it encourages dialogue among followers of different religions and cultures. King Abdullah has also announced a donation of $100 million to set up a United Nations Center for Fighting Terrorism. One of its 4 pillars is to prevent conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism and ensuring respect for human rights. So while the king's clerics preach a hardline form of Islam that often becomes a breeding ground for extremism, Saudi Arabia is assuming a moral high ground in advising other nations in transitional democracy.
A wave of criticism has hit Germany over its hefty arms deals with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations that also possess poor records of human rights. Berlin's weapons exports to the Gulf monarchies have almost tripled in just 2 years, from 570 million euros in 2011 to $1.5 billion almost in 2012. And Angela Merkel's government has approved weapons exports of more than 800 million euros in the first half of this year, suggesting that the level will continue to grow. The 6 countries in the region that Berlin sells weapons to are Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, several of which have seen government crackdowns on anti-regime protesters since the Arab Spring. Saudi Arabia is the biggest buyer, with arms imports last year worth 1.24 billion euros. Activists also claim German-made small firearms, ammunition, and military vehicles were commonly used by Middle Eastern and North African regimes to suppress peaceful demonstrations. Adam Kugel from Human Rights Watch believes foreign nations should put aside their business interests and think twice before supplying Gulf monarchies with weapons.
Western countries in general should look at the widespread crackdown that's going on against human rights, political and pro-reform activists going on in the country when they make these deals. These governments that have good relationships with the Saudis should make it clear that what they're doing it really goes against the pro-reform agenda that King Abdullah has been trumpeting since he came to power in 2005. What we've seen in the last, or at least I could say in 2013, is an increasing crackdown. We've seen many high-profile convictions over the last few months. Women's rights activists Fawzi Ayouni and Wajih Al-Awaider got 10 months in prison for merely trying to assist a woman who was in distress. Who claimed that she was not being provided enough food to live, and they went to her house to try to help her, and the police arrested her. So we're seeing a widespread campaign against anyone who speaks out against the policies of the current government, and any activist who calls for human rights reforms and political reforms. And I think that these Western countries that have military relationships or other relationships with Saudi Arabia should make clear that this is unacceptable behavior.